How has the landscape of terrorism evolved in the past decade?
I mean, I think there's always been different kinds of movements that were persistent throughout the last decade. It's just a question of how law enforcement attention or how researcher attention has shifted over these years. And so, of course, there's been far right movements that have been active in Canada and the US and in Europe from the early 20th century onwards. But what really changed, I think, in terms of our attention is two things. I think in 1995, attack on the Oklahoma City bombing really brought some attention on the far right potential for far right violence, but that was quickly kind of eclipsed, I would say, by 9/11, and then you had a decade or so of 9/11 related terrorism, Al Qaeda inspired actors and groups that were, trying to launch attacks in the West and things like that. And then that evolved with the foreign fighter phenomenon, with the rise of ISIS in 2012 and 2013, where a lot of people started to leave from Western countries to go join and go live in ISIS territory. And so then the focus became shifted a little bit to youth radicalization and why are these young people leaving? How can they leave the West and the comfort of the West? Because a lot of them were born here, grew up here, and then somehow still found the need to go overseas and so on. So that became a big concern for a little while, and then now we're kind of, particularly since the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, the shift has been on the alt-right and the far right, and kind of the multiple iterations or types within the far right, and so that includes yeah, white nationalists. That includes the manosphere kind of misogynist movements, incels, etc. And that also includes, especially now, kind of the anti-LGBTQ hate speech and violence that is popping up. And all of that sometimes is nested within the far right focus, but sometimes it exists kind of outside of that as well. So, it's evolved, I would say, that way over time.
Sure. And what exactly is terrorism, if we can go to first principles or the basic tenets of terrorism? Because it feels like a word that we're all familiar with, but
Yeah.
we all don't really understand it. What is it at its basic sense?
So, I mean, obviously in the academic space, there's multiple different definitions, but it's probably helpful just to focus on the legal one. So the FBI or the RCMP in Canada, they kind of define it as uh, ideologically motivated acts of violence that seek to produce some sort of societal change, right? And so all three of those are kind of important. So ideologically, the ideological part of it is what makes extremism and is what makes terrorism. And that ideology can be, Al Qaeda inspired, ISIS inspired, far right, etc. And so someone is doing an act of violence either towards other people or to infrastructure with the purpose of bringing about societal change, and they're doing that from an ideological kind of point of view. And so you kind of put those three together, and you have what terrorism means, right? And so that differentiates it, for example, from school shootings, domestic violence, gang violence, and stuff like that, because those are seen as um, not necessarily ideologically motivated, right? And so it's the ideology that makes it puts it into the category of terrorism or extremism.
And you mentioned far right ideology and far right extremism. Why the focus on the far right? Is it because the far right has a propensity towards terrorism, or is it something else?
Um, I don't know if propensity is the right word, but I think there have been numerous instances over the last several decades of lone actor violence, and so individuals who are swimming in this kind of far right ecosystem, online and offline, who produce acts of violence, right? So the London attacker in Canada, London, Ontario attacker in Canada, the Christchurch shooting, the Quebec mosque shooting, the Buffalo attack, the Allen, Texas attack, the El Paso attack. You can just kind of go down the list. And so these individuals weren't necessarily part of any group. They weren't card-carrying members of any organization like I am a member of the KKK or something like that, but they were consuming far right content and information. They were talking to other far right individuals, and then decided that there was a necessity to do something about it, to either kickstart the race war as they see it, or to kind of raise other people's awareness about what they're doing and what's necessary. And so if you read their manifestos, it's all about, I'm doing this so that white people can wake up and also take up arms and also kind of join me in this cause, right? And so it's not so much that there's a propensity for violence, it's that there has been multiple instances of violence. The larger concern with the far right is that because they're not necessarily listed terrorist entities like Al Qaeda or ISIS and so on, even though that's changing, um, they 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 tend to be a bit more mainstream, right? So they tend to be elected political officials. They tend to be members of government. They tend to be on TV like Tucker Carlson. And so then it becomes a question of how mainstream are these conversations. You would never have an ISIS supporter on TV, talking from their point of view, right? But then you do have anti-immigrant content, anti-LGBT content, misogynistic content, pretty widely shared without much check or balance, and so they just have a much bigger megaphone and have the potential to cause more societal harms, divisions, policy changes, that sort of thing, and so some of that is the attack component, which has happened, but there's a broader concern about large societal consequences of having these kinds of things mainstreamed, I guess.
Sure. And you mentioned before that it doesn't make sense how people are leaving the West to go to these countries and become radicalized or due to radicalization. Is there a process to radicalization? Is it something where it starts off as a seed and then continues to sprout? Is it, slowly like a trickle and then a flood? Like, what is radicalization and how does someone become radicalized?
So that's a difficult question because I think one of the main findings of all 50 years of extremism research is that not no one individual necessarily radicalizes the same way. They all have different they all have different upbringings. They all have different childhood struggles. They all have different mental health issues. They struggle with their parent life with their parents. They're bullied in high school. They have drug addictions. They go through breakups. And so the push factors are multiple and not really consistent across most people. You can say everyone they kind of struggled a little bit, etc. But a lot of people struggle and don't join don't join ISIS, and so
Sure.
um, it's not necessarily helpful that their parents are divorced as a kind of analytical tool, right? But I would say the pull factors are quite similar in the sense of everyone, a lot of these guys want and girls want. To kind of partake in a utopian society building, right? They want to take whether they're white nationalists or jihadists, like they want to go back to a kind of utopian past where they think it was perfect for them, their in group, whether it's religious in group or ethnic in group or racial in group. There was a utopian past, and we need to recreate that for the future, and it's our obligation to do that. And there are enemies that are going to stop us along that way. There are outside enemies. Who are going to stop us, but then there's also traitors and sellouts within our group who are going to try to stop us. And so I would say the pull factors are pretty general and pretty similar across ideologies, but in terms of how individuals radicalize, it tends to be kind of all over the board.
And just before we get to the next batch of questions, what's your background? How did you get into this field?
So I'm from Sri Lanka. I was born in Sri Lanka, came to Canada and when I was 6. And so, we came as refugees, fled the war zone there with between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil Tigers. Um, I my first day of undergrad was 9/11. And so that kind of was a major um, turning point for me in the sense of this is what I wanted to study, and I wanted to understand global politics. I wanted to understand how people come to choose violence and that sort of thing. And so I just followed that trajectory from undergrad to grad school to the PhD.
And you've written a couple books about Sri Lanka and the post-war construction. Can you speak more about those?
Yeah, so my PhD was on the end of the war in Sri Lanka in 2009. And as the war ended in Sri Lanka, the kind of Tamil community in the diasporas across the world in Toronto, Paris, London, et cetera, took to the streets, right? They were calling for a ceasefire. They were calling for Western governments to do something to kind of stop the killing that was going on in Sri Lanka. And so I looked at kind of diaspora activism for my PhD thesis. After that, I took a few trips to Sri Lanka to interview former militants, former Tamil Tigers who had kind of been captured or were on the run. Um, and so I got into these questions of post-conflict societies and how do you actually build trust because a lot of these fighters were struggling with struggling with reintegrating into a society that was first kind of policed by the government, who all saw, who saw them all as suspicious and suspect and former terrorists, etc. And then even when they went back to their own communities and their own families, there was a bit of a stigma there of like, oh, this guy fought over there, and if he moves into our neighborhood, then the government's going to watch us and follow us around also. And so the issue of post-conflict trust building and rebuilding became kind of interesting to me because and so I don't come at it from the kind of broader political science perspective where they look at but they look a bit more broadly, whereas I'm concerned really with how communities kind of evolve after conflict zones, after conflict happens. And so that was my work in Sri Lanka, particularly on that issue.
And so, I mean, you touched on some of the key challenges, in rebuilding societies after long-term conflicts, but how do you build that trust? It seems like trust is one of the main
Yeah.
concerns and also the main facets of that. So what is that like?
I mean, it's interesting because it plays out differently in different contexts. And so in Sri Lanka, um, yeah, people didn't, because of the surveillance, heavy surveillance that existed from the government on the former war zones. People just wanted to kind of be left alone to go about their day. They didn't want to bring suspicion into their communities, even if there were family members. And so that kind of continues. It died down a bit now, in 2024, but there's still elements of that in the society. When I did a little bit of field work in Iraq, particularly in Sinjar, the former kind of the where the Yazidis came from and were kidnapped by ISIS and taken as slaves, and back in 20 2014, I think. That was also a kind of deep distrust that built in because all of these people were saying, we can't go back home, and we refuse to go back home, back to Sinjar, and they continued to live on the kind of mountains because they said, well, our neighbors were the ones that turned us in, right? Our neighbors were the ones who gave us to ISIS and told us, told them who we are, etc. And so how can we go back and live next to them? And so we're just going to kind of continue to live on Sinjar Mountain, and so there was that kind of interpersonal community trust that broke down. But there was also the rebuilding issue. You had a government in Baghdad that refused to rebuild parts of the north that were destroyed by ISIS, and the conflict between ISIS and the government, because they said every time we rebuild, some other war comes, and they just, so why are we wasting money on these people? And so even, I went in 2019, and the war that particular war had ended several years beforehand, but there was zero rebuilding, right? Everything was still crumbled, and kids were going to school in rubble, and so that kind of post-conflict situation exists as well, where the government doesn't necessarily step in to help move the country forward or help reintegration happen. So yeah, I think it happens on multiple fronts.
And what is the role of education in preventing the resurgence of extremist ideologies post-war? It seems like it's such a, how would you say, such a volatile time and also an incredibly easy time for maybe extremist ideologies to come back. How do you rebuild but also kind of conceal?
Um, Yeah, the role of education is tricky because it's not like educated people don't become extremists, right? And so I want to be careful about saying that because um, there are a lot of guys who left from Canada and the US, for instance, were university educated, and they still found ISIS to be this kind of important organization for them to join. But in post-conflict zones, I think education is a facet of helping people kind of leave their contemporary situation, whether that's poverty, the inability to find work, and so on. So education is important on that front. But I think broader, especially for kind of poorer places, a lot of the problem is just unemployment, right? They just can't feed their families, they can't take care of their families, and so giving them an opportunity or giving them a window into how to leave their current circumstance is important. Is, I would say, more important, and potentially education is a part of that conversation, but it's not the only. it's not the only solution to kind of prevent, because we're doing some work on ISIS in Uganda at the moment, and you see that pop up a lot, right? Is that it doesn't necessarily matter what anyone else is doing. It's that people, these groups come in and they kidnap kids and they forcibly recruit children, and they take them away, and other people are drawn to them because that's the only group that's paying anything in the area, right? So if you're living in a society where the terrorist group is the only employer, it's kind of it becomes a somewhat easy choice for some people to be like, okay, well, there's no other opportunity for me, right? And um, so in those kind of contexts, the ideology becomes a little bit less important almost, right? Because they're not joining out of a deep commitment to ISIS and ISIS ideology. They're doing it for financial reasons, or they were actually forcibly recruited. So it's different in different contexts that way.
Yeah, I think we're touching on a really interesting and important point, which is why people gravitate, not just in the West towards them, but why people in other countries gravitate towards them. I wasn't even aware that ISIS was paying people to come and work for them, which may be obvious to some people, but I think there are a lot of there's a lot of ignorance with these groups that we just
Mhm.
see on the news and we accept that. But can you speak more about what are the, I guess, incentives, which is a strange word to use, of these terrorist groups in bringing in people?
Yeah, I mean, I think for people in the war zones themselves, like if you're Syrian, if you're Iraqi, if you're part of some of the African regions that ISIS is very strong in, the financial component is relevant, is important. But for Westerners who went, I would say they left purely much more for ideological reasons. Obviously, you're not leaving Toronto to go join ISIS in Syria for financial reasons, right? And so. Um, uh, for them, it was part of a building a kind of historical caliphate, this kind of turning point in history that they wanted to be a part of, and so. For people who left from the West, it was much more of an ideological motive. For people on the ground, it was ideology also, but it was also, for some, it was thrill seeking. For others, it was financial. I remember interviewing some guys in Morocco who said, we just went for the summer and came back, right? We school was over. We went to join ISIS in the summer, and then we came back and went back to school. It was just like it was just something to do that summer for them, right? It was just like they heard there was this thing going on and they wanted to be just get a taste of it. Of course, it's a very dangerous summer job, but at the same time, it's they just wanted to kind of get a sense of what's happening instead of just reading about it, for instance. So.
So some kids in America go to Italy for the summer, and then some people in Morocco go to ISIS for the summer, which is strange.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah.
No, I mean, it's not the majority of people who left from Morocco, but there were these young people who, yeah, they're reading about what the conflict in Syria. They're watching ISIS propaganda, and they're like, well, let's go see what it's about, right? And the challenge there, of course, also was the nobody in the Moroccan government was necessarily stopping them, and so it wasn't like Canada where we tried to stop them at the airport and we tried to catch them in Egypt when they crossed, and they were working with the Turkish authorities to try to stop them when they tried to cross into Syria. The Moroccans just said, if you want to go help the fight against the Assad regime, we're fine with that, right? And it's kind of like how we told Canadians, Ukrainian Canadians, they can go if they want to go fight Russia. And so it was an element of that in some of these other contexts.
What are they seeing that we in the West are not? It seems like there's obviously anti-ISIS propaganda, but also pro-ISIS propaganda. How do those differentiate? Not just superficially, like one is pro and one is against, but what are they feeding people in terms of, the content? And also, how are they feeding people? Are they using Twitter and Facebook? It doesn't seem like they're
So
using those kinds of platforms.
that's evolved over time. So in 2013, 2014, it was mainstream platforms like Twitter and Facebook. You would open your Twitter account and there were beheading videos, and it was very much like a lot of these platforms got taken over by ISIS propaganda in 2013, 2014. And then social media platforms brought down the hammer and suspended all these accounts in over time, and they migrated, particularly in 2015, to Telegram, which is still very popular for extremist groups of all stripes. And so that was their home for a very long time until about 20. 2018, 2019. And now they're kind of trickling about in different platforms. But in the propaganda space, that's where it all came from. In terms of motivation, I would say a lot of the guys I spoke with just wanted to live in a more Islamic society as they deemed it, right? So they wanted to leave the West. They thought the West was corrupt. Thought the West was corrupting their religious identity. And they wanted to be part of this historical moment, right? And I think it's the equivalent of the kingdom of God, being established on the earth. And they're like, well, obviously I'm going to go live there. So for them, it was this kind of utopian society was being built, and they wanted to be a part of it instead of just kind of watching it happen from abroad. Um, that's the ISIS component. There are a lot of other Westerners who went to join other groups also, like Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda linked groups like that. And for them, there was the fight against the Assad regime that was primary, to kind of take part in this revolution in Syria, and so that became a more important cause for them. And a lot of people switched groups after they got there. So it was a chaotic period, right, from I would say 2013 to 2019 or so. But I think for a good chunk of people who joined ISIS, it was this being part of this utopian society building, kind of like what you're seeing with the neo-Nazis now. With we're going to build a white ethno state at some point, or and so it's this kind of society building revolutionary spirit that they want to be kind of part of. We may obviously disagree with what that revolution means, but for them, it's very real and worth sacrificing for.
I'm uneducated in this space, but what is the Assad regime and why are they fighting?
So the Assad regime is the kind of or Bashar al-Assad is the dictator in who's run Syria. And so after the Arab Spring started in 2010 and 2011 in Egypt and Yemen and other countries, protests also started in Syria. And in 2011, and that protest movement, that revolution to overthrow the Assad regime, morphed, or the activists on the ground would say it got hijacked by jihadist groups, and then it turned into a kind of jihadist protest. And so different groups and militant groups popped up in Syria. Al Qaeda arrived, ISIS arrived, and then they became the primary drivers of the anti-Assad war, right? And so Syria descended into civil war from 2012 to very recently, and now it seems like it's popping off again. But so that's kind of the context in which ISIS operated, and so ISIS was able to take over in that chaos. They were able to take over mass amounts of territory and declare a caliphate, to declare that they run this space, and it's Islamic law that's being practiced in that space. And then that caliphate became a draw for people in the West and everywhere else to kind of go and live and fight and kind of help this new country, as they saw it, survive. And so that was happening in parallel to the civil war in Syria, with the other militants fighting against the Assad regime.
This is going to be a really stupid metaphor or analogy, but it seems like a lot of these issues are, dark chocolate, where people know it's there, but they don't really want to engage with it. They're not really interested. And then the main issues that we're dealing with, like stuff that's going on in Ukraine and Israel, these are the milk chocolate. Everybody wants to talk about them.
Mhm.
The reason I kind of phrase it in this way is there is kind of a distaste for talking about certain countries or certain issues around the world, even though these are equally real and equally as important to talk about. What is this kind of social, societal, cultural bias against certain issues and for certain ones?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. Clifford Bob, who's a political scientist, wrote a book a couple of years ago called Marketing Rebellion, where he kind of explores that question. Is like, why does everyone know about Gaza and nobody knows about the Uyghurs in China, right? Or why does everyone follow the Middle East but nobody follows, the struggle of the Tibetans or the struggle of the Taiwanese or whoever? And he basically says there are multiple reasons, but it's kind of a marketing game, right? It's like, do you have a charismatic leader? who can bring that issue to Western audiences, to mainstream media. So Dalai Lama is a great example of someone who single-handedly brought the Tibetan issue to everyone else. They had Richard Gere, who was who was a very important mouthpiece for the Dalai Lama, and brought the Tibetan issue to mainstream media, et cetera. So I think it is a struggle um, on the marketing side of things, because everyone has a cause. There are multiple civil wars going on in Myanmar alone, for instance, that nobody knows about. There's the Rohingya issue, which very few people pay attention to. Um, so that I think that's just an ongoing struggle. The added reason for that, I think, is also geopolitical significance, right? So what happens in Israel, Gaza matters to the West. It matters to the kind of ongoing struggle between geopolitical actors that makes what happens there more important in a way, aside from the civilian casualties, which everyone should be paying attention to. But they have what happens in Russia and Ukraine has global consequences in terms of NATO allies, and the potential to expand into a broader conflict. Same thing with Lebanon and Israel, and so on. So that's, I think, part of the reason why people pay attention to these conflicts, because they have the ability to trickle out and draw other countries into a kind of regional conflict, which has economic, social, political consequences. Whereas these smaller issues, which are sometimes equally devastating in terms of their humanitarian costs, don't have those geopolitical implications, and so people just kind of turn the page, right? And so they say, "Oh, that's unfortunate," but then they turn the page. It's not. It doesn't become a cause. That's changing a little bit with social media, I think, because you do have Uyghur activists and Rohingya activists, on Twitter, on all these social media platforms, constantly making sure it's in our face. So that's a good thing. But it is still an ongoing challenge. I don't necessarily have a answer on how to fix it, but it is an ongoing thing.
Uh, And this is again, I guess, a personal question for you, but when you're studying these things, how do you stay mentally fit or mentally well? Because if we're talking about the average person, they see the stuff going on in Ukraine, devastating. See the stuff going on between Israel and Gaza, devastating. But if you tack on Myanmar and all of these other places, it becomes almost numb. Like
Mhm.
you can't take in all that information. It's too much. Like horror and gore and all of these things. So for yourself, when you're studying these, how do you stay, I guess happy is a silly word to use, but how do you stay unaffected?
I mean, I'm definitely not unaffected, but I do think I think I teach about these conflicts all the time, and so teaching about it helps me process it, and pass it on to students and so on. So I teach a course here called Religion and Violence, where I talk about Rohingya, I talk about Hindu nationalists, I talk about Myanmar, Sri Lanka, um, the Uyghurs, etc., white nationalists, all sorts of things. And so um, talking about that stuff helps in terms of passing on that information, being an activist type on social media to kind of push that awareness helps. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just something we have to live with, because you don't want to, you have to tap out once in a while, but um, we have to think of ourselves, I think, as privileged actors in these spaces where we live in relative comfort, and other people don't. And we have a mouthpiece and we have a platform, and we should try to, we owe that much, right? We owe at least a little bit to kind of keep those things in the public perception. So yeah, I wouldn't say I'm unaffected, but I kind of see it as a purpose in terms of keeping some of these lesser known conflicts in people's consciousness as much as possible.
Yeah, you use a great word, process. Like you have a way to process it all by
Yeah.
teaching and everything. One of the problems I see with my generation in particular is that they don't have a way necessarily to process it, but in fact, they don't really want to process it. They just see something and they share it,
Mhm.
which is very concerning because they may be sharing things that are just fundamentally not true or a skewed truth, but regardless, they're not spending time to critically think. So I guess there's two questions. Number one, how does that inability or hesitancy to fact check or to validate what you're sharing influence radicalization, influence all of these groups operating in different countries? But number two is how should Gen Z even start to critically think about issues? It seems like they take a side and they don't even want to hear what the other side is talking about, which I think is I understand it, but it's also quite concerning and it's a negative trait. You need to hear
Yeah.
both sides and then make your decision.
It's going to get much worse because we're dealing now with deep fakes. We're dealing now with algorithmic bias in terms of how these platforms push content towards people. I remember at the start of the Israel-Gaza thing in right after October 7th, it was almost impossible to know what was true and what was not, right?
Yeah.
Because it was just this kind of fog of information. It's like, oh, a missile struck a hospital, and then the next day would be like, well, the missile came from inside Gaza or didn't it? And then was it a hospital or wasn't it? And then it was like, well, there were beheaded babies, and then they were like, no, there weren't. And the president Biden says, I saw the photos, and then they were like, no, he didn't. He just heard about them, and you're just like, what are you guys like? This isn't misinformation online. This is the president of the United States, right? And so you started to get very annoyed with information. And I found myself just being like, I'm not going to, and journalists themselves are making these mistakes. And because they're also looking to social media to kind of see what's happening. And so it became this kind of fog of war. Um, and I think some of that was driven by disinformation machines, like actually creating false information so that people can share them and then they can discredit them, and then everyone just kind of wipes their hands, right? And kind of goes away. Um, and so that's an important context, I think, in how these wars are being fought and how human rights issues are going to be dealt with, is because if you can fatigue people with information onslaught that can't be verified, what you're most likely to do is close the computer and walk away. And that's kind of the objective, I think. Call me a conspiracy theorist. That's kind of the objective, in the sense of we want people to disengage from this, and so we want to flood you with information to the point where you're exhausted. And so that I think happened a little bit after October 7th. I think it was Ta-Nehisi Coates from the New Yorker, who put it well. He said, "Yeah, the ins and outs of the conflict are complicated, but what's actually not complicated is the most important part of the conflict, which is that there are human rights violations going on, right? And so you don't need to know the history of the conflict and all this kind of stuff to have a moral stance on what is actually happening." And so that was a good message, I think, for a lot of young people to hear, because there was this thing of like, the Israel-Palestine thing is too complicated for me to even have an opinion about. And you're like, well, that may be true, but you don't have to have an opinion on the conflict. You can have an opinion on what's happening right now. And that part is pretty clear, right? And so I think that's important for young people to think about. In terms of sharing too quickly, yeah, I think the retweet button, the like button, the share button are all things you need to be careful with, because sometimes people share things that they don't even read. They just read the tweet. They don't click on the article to read what the article is saying. And so, or sometimes people will push people, retweet people based on the content that they're putting out, but they don't know everything else that person has been saying for the last 5 years. This happened to me once, where someone made a joke, and I retweeted it, and then I got a DM from a friend immediately being like, "Do you know the guy that you just retweeted?" And I was like, "No, I was just retweeting the tweet. It's just the one tweet." And he's like, "Well, he's like a Holocaust denier." And then sure enough, you
Wow.
went back into his profile and you go down, and it's like all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And so then I had to go and unretweet it, because I'm like, I don't want to push this guy to people who are following me. And so you make these kind of mistakes, right? So I think it's just a question of slowing down, and putting out content and sharing content from trusted sources, and doing the best you can that way. There are going to be times when even the trusted sources make mistakes, and that's okay. But that doesn't mean like the whole media and academic and edifice needs to crumble, right? It just needs to be done more slowly. I think journalists are making mistakes sometimes also because they are driven themselves by social media and what goes viral on social media. And then that becomes a news story. Um, so sometimes they're losing the broader kind of unreported narratives and unreported stories just because something goes viral on Twitter and that's gamed, right? That's bot activity, that's disinformation campaigns, and so you can make something go viral on Twitter and it's not authentic. And then if you're looking for what goes viral as what you're going to write your news stories about, because you think that's what people care about, that's not true, right? And so I think journalists themselves need to kind of step back a little bit and slow down a bit here. But I think the advice for all of us, I think, is just to slow down a bit because we're these little things in our pockets now are kind of outrage machines, right?
Yes.
And so as you said, like it facts and slow thinking and moving slowly is not what these devices are designed for, and when these platforms are designed for, they're designed to kind of push black and white thinking very fast and very far. And if you don't want to participate in that, then you just need to kind of slow down a bit. They're still useful um, in terms of news and seeing what people outside the mainstream are talking about, et cetera. But you just have to be a bit more careful now, especially these days with AI and deep fakes and all these things that are just going to complicate all of that even more.
Yeah, the deepfake issue is one thing that I'm not particularly looking forward to when we already can't really tell the difference between AI generated stuff, text versus, human generated, and then now we won't be able to tell whether a video of the president announcing a war against a country is real or
Yeah.
not, and those things will spread as fast as possible. Um, you did mention conspiracy theories. Do those play any role in terms of radicalizing people or getting people towards an extremist ideology?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, I think conspiracy theories and pseudoscience and are all kind of part of the mix. There was some research back in 2010 which called it a radicalization multiplier. And so conspiracy theories it's not going to cause you to become radicalized necessarily, but it can as part of one ingredient in the soup to kind of push you further down that line, right? Is because conspiracy theories have a great way of taking everything you feel and take all the injustices that you feel and all the victimization you're feeling and give you someone to blame, right? And so they say, well, you lost your job and you have to stay home for 2 years and your kids' school is closed. Well, you know whose fault that is? That's part of this deep state cabal over here and with politicians and the Great Reset and George Soros and they're Fauci and so on, and they're the ones doing this to you, right? And so you can take all of these disparate, not connected things that are happening to your life, and they all become part of the story, right? This is all happening to me because of the Jews or because of the CIA or because of the Illuminati or whoever. And so they have a very good conspiracy theories are very good at explaining why something happened and tell you who's doing that to you, and then um, and we see the consequences, right? There's QAnon related violence. There's the guy in Canada who drove into Prime Minister Trudeau's house, saying that I just wanted to talk to Trudeau for why I don't have a job, etc. And so I think they have a great ability to kind of push people further down this kind of black and white thinking.
Yeah, it's strange how like the conspiracy theories are absolutely a multiplier, and also conspiracy theories on social media with people who are I'm guessing these radicalize this propensity to radicalization is kind of like an identity crisis for young people. Like they feel the need to be a part of something, and so they just immediately latch on to whatever they see on social media. Is that true? And how do we get young people away from this? Because it seems like they're growing up with, as you were saying, this device in their pocket, which is an outrage machine that they can say whatever they want on it without really any consequences yet. And they're getting the likes, they're getting the social status points, and then they're also contributing unknowingly towards this like larger issue, which is, terrorism or, you know, social injustice, etc. Do you talk to your students about this and like tell them what what
Yeah, no,
like
I
what
think
power they have?
I think they're aware of it actually. I mean, I think I don't know if they're so I teach 18 first year to graduate school, and so usually they're in their early 20s, and they're participating in something that they fully understand, right? So that's the challenge, is like, I know this device has control over me. I check it 10 times a day. I like when people like and share my content. I like getting retweeted. I like, having views and all of these things. So I know that that's harmful, and I know that's how I'm consuming this information, but I'm still doing it, right? I'm still continuing to live that way. Um, and so again, that's going back to your education question. I don't think it's just like, hey, this is how algorithms work, and this is how because they kind of know that already. That might be true for older generations, but the digital natives of today, like, they know algorithms. They know how they're being pushed information for the most part. I just don't know if they're stopping to think about how am I spending my day, right? And so my oldest daughter has a phone now, and I show her, like, you spent 2 hours on TikTok today, like having that, even that numerical feedback that didn't used to always exist on iPhones, of like, these are the apps you use today, and this is how much time you spent on each of them, and this is your daily average of how many, what you checked and what you did. That in itself is kind of useful for, I think, your social media diet, right? And trying to bring all that stuff down. But yeah, it's one of these things where it's so integrated into our lives now that I don't think getting rid of it is the option or helpful necessarily. Um, because you can't, it's just like the credit card, right? You can't really do anything if you don't have a credit card. Great. It's probably better for your finances if you don't have one, but you can't check into a hotel. You can't book a flight. You can't do anything without a credit card anymore. And so the phone is kind of like that, where sure, it's harmful, and sure, it has harmful potential, but it's so integrated into our lives, our emails, our calendars, our text messages, keeping in touch with family and friends, and or how we listen to music, how we watch shows. And so it's kind of hard to put that away. It's just a question of being conscious of how you're using it, and whether it's taking over your life, right? I think it's just going back to, like, all things in moderation. Like, you just gotta keep it at bay so it doesn't take over your life.
Can I ask you a personal question about your daughter and the use
Mhm.
of the phone and TikTok and everything? Because I say that for my kids, I'm gonna have like the birds and the bees talk. I'm gonna have the drug talk, but I'm also gonna have a technology talk with them to really
Yeah.
explain to them what this device is, how it's hijacking them, how it wants them to use it as much as possible. So for yourself, how do you get your daughter, maybe kids in general, to use it in a healthy manner? Is it just with, hey, I love you and I understand the necessity for someone your age to use this, but this is precisely how these things are affecting your mind and your brain. These are the kinds of insecurities that you may develop as you grow older, as you use it more. Is it having that heart to heart, but also very transparent
Yeah.
conversation?
I mean, I think, yeah, having that conversation daily about how they're using their devices, what they're seeing on their is enormously important. I make her watch some of these documentaries that have come out on Netflix and so on. I made her read a bunch of content about social media algorithms and how they work, and so getting her better educated on how it works is useful. I don't think it's having an impact on how she actually uses it. And that's where the secondary thing comes in, is that I actually put strict limitations on everything that happens on her phone, right? And so through the uh, Apple Family feature, you can actually do quite a bit in terms of what hours they're allowed to be on it, what app per app limitations. So I have a strict limit on hour and a half on TikTok per day. And so you can actually go down and say, well, what apps do you need and what apps you're using? And so that is there to say, you may know that this is not great, that spending 6 hours on this is great, but you're young and you have friends and who are all, you're going to be unable to do it. And therefore, um, here's a bit of top down, top down pressure.
Yeah.
And so I think both of those are important, is that it's not just the awareness that's going to stop us from having bad behaviors, right? And so that's been true of human nature since day one. Just knowing about it doesn't mean we're going to behave better. Um, so you do need some top down limitations to make sure that you don't spiral.
And how did she respond to that? Because I'm always afraid, and apologies if you don't want to talk about your family as much, but I'm always afraid that if I enact these same procedures or frameworks or restrictions, that my kids would like rebel. Like if I don't put any restrictions, they'll go off the deep end. But if I put restrictions, they'll find a way around them and go even more off the deep end.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess it's my youth, because I'm only 23, but yeah.
No, no, I mean, I think part of parenting is those restrictions are in place. I told her if you delete the app, like I have a bunch of monitoring apps, or one monitoring app in terms of that kind of keeps track of what she's doing there. And I said, if you delete it, I'm taking the phone, right? And so I think part of parenting is, yeah, those things are in place. Um, I don't know if you've read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation,
Yep.
where he makes the point there. It's like we've kind of reversed our understanding of safety. Like we used to, like now we're so afraid of what's going on outside that we tell kids to stay inside. We don't realize that they have the entire world at their fingertips, and it's actually much more harmful in on multiple ways than going to the park,
Yeah.
right? Um, so I'm easing up on the parenting on the outside stuff because I think that you know, so my daughter's always like, oh, can I go to the mall? Can I go here with my friend's house? And I'm like, nah, yeah, go do all that, right? Because I think our sense of safety is like, oh, you just stay home, and just stay home doesn't work anymore because it's actually way more harmful things that are happening with their devices than going to their friend's house. And so I would much rather have her be out in the world doing stuff and then just staying at home and on her phone. So there's restrictions in the online, there's restrictions on her phone, but then I've eased up restrictions in other parts of her life. To answer your question about like rebellion. So like if I put restrictions on her phone and I was like, you can't go anywhere,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
might
Yeah.
be a problem. And so as long as you can kind of balance that out, it's been fine.
It's interesting how there is like this process of radicalization, not just for terrorist groups, but also for teenagers in whatever they want to do. Like that you can radicalize them towards an insecurity, for
Hmm.
example. You can radicalize them towards like a mental illness. And I always find that interesting in a strange way, but it's always peculiar how the more we use it, the more neuroses we develop in some way. And that's why I don't know if I want my kids to even touch technology at all, because there is a much deeper, layered, complex world in
Hmm.
cyberspace, which I don't think we're adapted for, especially with it being every hour, every minute, every second, constant notifications. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's a little tangent on a tangent. So just the last couple of questions. Do you think radicalization can ever be entirely eradicated? Like, could we develop a technology or a social structure that disincentivizes it completely?
No. And I don't think necessarily radicalization is a bad thing. I think radicalization to violence is a bad thing. But there's always this discussion in the field of, Martin Luther King Jr. was called a radical during his life. Malcolm X was considered a radical during his life. Um, and so on. So a lot of people who push the envelope, who are doing things that are against the status quo, have always been labeled radicals. And so we do want to be careful about um, putting smothering activism and smothering progressive movements and so on. Where I draw the line is kind of attack on civilians and civilian casualties. And so if you want to push your anti-immigrant sentiment as far as you want to go, that keeps it on the legal side of the hate speech debate and the violence debate, knock yourself out. Um, but if you're going to then rent a car and drive and kill a bunch of people going for an afternoon walk, like happened here in London, Ontario, um, that's where that line stops, right? And so I think radicalization in terms of thinking outside the box and pushing social boundaries is a good thing, but the violence, and we want to help kids do that and help people think, we don't want to just create a bunch of generation of robots who are just parroting what society is telling them, because with that we wouldn't have had the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, anything, any of the social progressive movements that we've seen over the last 50, 60 years wouldn't have happened if everyone was just faithfully following the government and everything it wanted to say. But yeah, so I do think radicalization is a good thing. It's the violence that needs to be put a check on, I think.
Roger that. Are there any concerning trends in terms of extremism or radicalization to violence that are occurring right now?
I think the major trend now is what some people have called like nihilistic violence. So a lot of people I talk to who work with in the radicalization space, or the de-radicalization space, are pointing out that there's a lot of young people who are just love violence now. So they don't know what to do with that, right? Like, is it ideological or is it not? Because some guys will, like, there was a few guys in Canada who started out looking at ISIS content, and then they became neo-Nazis, and then they became, part of some other movement. And how these social workers are dealing with it is they say, well, the only real commonality there is that you just want to see destruction, right? You just like it does. So the ideology that you put on doesn't actually matter. You just have this attraction to violence and social destruction. And so this kind of hatred for humanity as a whole, right? And so you want to kind of destroy society that way. And so they don't know if that's like a psychological issue, ideological issue that needs to be dealt with, and how to actually respond. So they're calling it nihilistic violence, which is a bit of it, it's not massive numbers, but it is, we are seeing it more and more. And so that's something that's worrying, because they don't neatly fit into any boxes, and they just seem to want to kill people for the sake of it. And so that's going to be a challenge if it grows from where it's at now.
That's such a strange thing, nihilistic violence, just killing to
Just
just
killing for
because
the sake of killing. Yeah.
for the sake of killing, just because they're bored, or did they watch a weird TV show?
I think it's just a hatred of humanity, probably arising from hatred of themselves, and kind of a revenge motive. Life has put me in this situation, and society has to pay, right?
See, this is the dangerous thing about precisely that, which is a lot of young people especially, they see what's going on in the world in terms of the climate changing, in terms of how, species are dying, in terms of geopolitical turmoils or political turmoils, and they say, let's just end it all. Let's just nuke everything. Let's start over. And we laugh when they say this because they are half joking, but
Yeah.
they're half joking. They actually kind of want that. And then these nihilistic criminals go on and commit these violent acts, killing just for the sake of killing innocent people, but we don't see a linkage between that. And it's like, yeah, I understand that those people may have mental illnesses going on, but when people say on social media, let's just end it all, I think we should take those comments seriously. Like, we're
Yeah.
coming to a point where what you say on social media is not just a digital artifact or a digital figment. It does have real consequences.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do think it comes from a deep-seated situation where people are feeling like whatever dreams and goals that they have aren't going to be realized, right? And so this is the only generation which will make less money and not own a home compared to their parents and their parents, right? And so it was supposed to be that every generation got better, every generation got materially and you know job security wise get better as it goes along. And this is the only generation which feels the opposite. So they're going to graduate from university in more debt, can't own a house, and will very likely be unemployed, or at least not to have the job that they wanted or they went to school for. And so that creates a lot of anxiety and anger towards society as a whole, because you've told me I can, if I just work hard, I can be good. Things will be good. And it turns out that's not really guaranteed. And so that is gonna invite in a lot of anger. In the Middle East, leading up to the Arab Spring, they called it waithood, and so they called it the period between childhood and adulthood, where uh, kids were 20 somethings were just kind of waiting around, right? Waiting to start a family, waiting to get that perfect job, waiting to buy that house. And they just lived in this limbo period of where nothing happened, right? And you put 20-year-olds in that space and you're asking for trouble, right? And because this is the time where they're leaving school, leaving their parents behind and starting their life out. And if you don't give them something to live for, it's going to backfire. And so that is the danger, I think, that, like as you mentioned, where they're posting these kinds of things online, which is like, what was all of it for, right? What am I doing? Why am I working this hard if nothing's guaranteed at the end of it? And it's not like they're 60 or 70 or like on the verge of retirement. They're just starting their life and they're already kind of feeling a little level of hopelessness, and that's a dangerous place to be.
And that's where the nihilistic violence comes in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for people, not these people who want to commit nihilistic violence, but for Gen Z in general? You know, they're the first generation that will suffer from all of these circumstantial consequences or problems. What do you have to say to them and to keep them hopeful? You know, just to get them back on the right track.
Yeah. I mean, people don't often come to me for hopeful, but I think yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say. I think I mean, I have so many friends who are graduating with PhDs now who are working at restaurants, right? And so the hopeful messaging, universities getting less funding, certain sectors are getting way less funding, and so these jobs are just not going to be there when people graduate. And so I don't know if hopeful is the way to go. I think being strategic about what the future is going to look like economically, in terms of the job market, um, in terms of societally is important, and kind of preparing for that is probably as far as I can go in terms of hopeful. Um, and that means like we'll probably a lot of things that people wanted to do are going to be much harder. Um, and it is shifting. Like when I ask my 8-year-old what he wants to be when he grows up, he says he wants to be a YouTube streamer, right? And so that's what's replaced like fireman and astronaut from earlier generations. And so and I'm like, maybe there are people making money on it, and so it's like maybe that is part of what the future looks like. And so it's just becoming aware and strategic about how you can monetize and fit your skill set into the changing labor market, I think is a good way to think about it. Um, like my early undergrad teacher told me, like, find out what you want to find out what you would do if you had all the money in the world, and find a way to monetize that, right? What do you like doing every day? I'm like, well, I like reading and writing and thinking all day. And he's like, great, find a way to get paid for it, right? Um, and I think that thinking about your passion and kind of creative ways to monetize it, I think is good to kind of keep some of that hopelessness at bay. Um,
Yeah, thank you for that, for being, as real as possible. Last question, it doesn't have to be along the lines of the podcast, but if you had a magic wand and you could solve one problem in the world, what would it be and why?
One problem in the world. Probably climate change, because I think that the consequences of that are going to be so sweeping that I don't even think we've thought about it, like in terms of even its impact on extremism and civil wars, and the conflict over water and conflict over resources. It's going to have so much wide-ranging consequences that I don't even think we've creatively thought that far yet. And we see what it's already all the things that it's already doing in terms of natural disasters and droughts and wildfires and stuff like that. And I think I mean, according to climate scientists, we might have already missed the boat on it. But I think to your question of magic wands, I think that's where I would put the attention.
Yeah, I'm upset that I didn't ask that question sooner. I would have loved to touch more on climate change and extremism, but maybe for round two. Professor, this has been a great conversation. Where can we find you online?
I'm still sticking around on Twitter at Amar Amarasingam. I'm on Blue Sky, but you can just Google me. My faculty page at Queen's University is online, and I'm happy to receive emails and chat with anyone. So
Great. Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
thank you.